Hi, my name's Dan Schustak. This is the presentation I gave at the Association of Field Ornithologists earlier this fall in October, and I just want to share that with you now. So I've been studying dark-eyed juncos for a few years now, and the larger context and background and reason for this study is really centered around the migration strategies of juncos. So if we look at the northern portion of their range in this area that's sort of the orangish color on this map from the birds of the world, we see that they are an obligate latitudinal migrate. So the dark-eyed juncos vacate most of this northern portion of their range. In the southern portion of their range, specifically looking at the eastern North America, we see that there's an area here in the Appalachian Mountains where they are resident year round, or they're found year round, and it turns out that these are largely resident populations. And then when we get into this area shaded in purple in the east, we have portions of their annual range where the species found year round, but we don't actually know the degree to which they are migrants, or perhaps the summer breeding birds are just being replaced by northern latitudinal migrants. This pattern of there being this region of a species range where it's found year round in between a northern latitudinal migrant and then a southern portion where the range is occupied during the winter. This is not an uncommon pattern. It's found in a bunch of different taxonomic groups. And it turns out in the dark-eyed junco that there's actually two different subspecies in eastern North America. The northern Hymalis subspecies, that's this obligate latitudinal migrant to the north, and this carolinensis, this southern subspecies in the southern portion of the Appalachians, which is a year-round resident, and in some cases seems to be an altitudinal migrant, just going just a few kilometers downslope in the winter, for instance. So we know to the far north, these Hymalis subspecies is an obligate migrant, and to the south, they're a resident or altitudinal migrant. And at the extremes of their range, there are morphological differences in these two different subspecies. In the area where we did this study here in western Massachusetts, we have the subspecies Hymalis that's found throughout the year. So both the breeding season, migration periods, and the overwintering periods. So the question is, what's going on in between these northern obligate migrants, obligate latitudinal migrants, and these southern resident or altitudinal migrants? So we know that in Pennsylvania, maybe somewhere around the northern border of Pennsylvania, southern border of New York, somewhere in there, um, there's this intergrade zone where there's morphological change or intergradation between the southern subspecies and the northern subspecies in morphology. So, is that possibly also going on in some way with migratory behavior, going from a migratory pattern to a sedentary pattern in the southern portion? And is there some sort of mix going on in this intergrade zone? So that's what we're looking at, trying to understand that behavior. And at first, just trying to describe the different migratory strategies of juncos that are breeding in that area of shaded purple on the map, specifically in western Massachusetts. So we're looking at from the Berkshire Hills here in western Massachusetts. Up in the mountains, it's higher elevation, and during the winter, it's colder, snowier, and icier versus the valleys. So the valleys get less snow cover throughout the year, less total amount of snow, and it's warmer and there's more open ground throughout the winter, although it does get still snow down in the valleys. So we have some ecological context here that's similar to areas in the southern portion of the uh, Junco Hymalis carolinensis range, where we have the altitudinal migration up and down the Appalachian Mountains. Well, it's possible that that behavior is happening here in our mountains of western Massachusetts as well. So that's one of the behaviors we were curious if it's taking place or not. And all of this fits into our longer term research objective to try to describe and understand junco migration strategies, and ultimately trying to understand their ecological causes and the implications, especially in this suspected intergrade zone where there's some sort of transition from a obligate migrant to a sedentary migratory strategy. The focus on this particular talk is to present observations and results from one of our winter intensive study sites. So we've used a lot of several different approaches to try to study this larger long-term research objective. And one of them has been related to or following the efforts of intensive banding at some of these mountain sites. So the specific mountain site or study site that's up in the mountains of the Berkshire Hills is in western Massachusetts in Berkshire County. We call it the Yard. Actually, one of our co-authors here, Ed, it's his yard, so sometimes we call it Ed's Yard. which is at his cabin in the woods. The elevation is about 530 feet, 530 meters in elevation. Juncos are known to breed here. Ed's been living at this cabin for about 15 years, and he's had juncos breeding in his yard and around the forests around his yard. And they're also regular winter visitors, where Ed's had a feeding station, a bird feeder, for about 15 years. So he knows they're there year round. So that turned out to be a good collaboration here with Ed, our co author, with his ongoing and lifelong interest in birds and interest in observing juncos. So a little bit of landscape context here. So on this image, this air photo, we're actually looking in this little yard right here. So I want you to note that it's in this heavily forested landscape, and there are multiple privately owned parcels surrounding this our study site here. This area that I circled here in red is about a 1 acre clearing, and there's gardens, a yard, beehives, and a little old field. So that's about 1 acre, and you can see there's a couple other areas that are cleared within this 500-meter buffer circle, and then the yellow showing a 1 kilometer buffer. But there's multiple private landowners there, so access turns out to be really challenging because of the private ownership and numerous owners of those properties. So we've really concentrated at banding at Ed's property here, and we banded throughout the year. Here's some ground level views of what it looks like here at different times of the years. Actually, here's some evening grosbeaks in winter 2021. There are lots of grosbeaks hanging out around here, but the juncos also come in and pick up the seeds off the ground and eat the seeds that are scattered on the grounds as well. So depending on the weather, we'd set up mist nets if the air temperatures were warm enough and lacking precipitation and so on. Here's my co-authors here, Hannah and Ed, working on this net here. So we'd put up nets around the feeding stations, and during the more challenging weather conditions, cold temperatures, and even if it was snowing, we could still use the single cell potter trap. So we'd set those on the ground. They're walk-in traps, and we'd catch the juncos that way when the weather conditions weren't appropriate for mist nets. And then occasionally the weather was so bad we couldn't do single cell potter traps either. We'd take the birds from outside, bring them inside to band and process them, take standard morphological measurements. And we repeated this over a couple winters. We had 2 full winters. Our first winter started late, and then we ran into COVID. But we had 11 trap seasons in our second winter and 14 in our subsequent winter, the third winter. And we would color band these individuals so they were uniquely identifiable by looking out the windows of the cabin. So Ed has a spotting scope and several windows around his cabin where he would keep a lookout and record color combinations of the birds he would see, not every day, but very regularly throughout the fall, winter, and spring. So you can see the color codes on there, and we would record the color observations. And Ed literally spent many, 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 many hours scoping out and reciting the juncos through the cabin window. So we don't have specific effort data on the observations, in part because the observations were somewhat fortuitous, in that if there was a junco noted, Ed would grab his scope and see who it was, and if one junco was noted, often there would be another. So there wasn't a specific effort, but there was, especially during the winter, nearly daily observations. Harsh weather conditions would make that challenging. Deep snow, the legs of the bands of the birds wouldn't be visible, and so on. But there was regular, repeated observation efforts by Ed, and ultimately culminating in literally thousands of resites of these juncos over these couple winters. So let me share a few takeaways from our banding and resiting efforts. So winter site fidelity is low for juncos. So from our first winter to returning the next winter, we only had one return. Number of winter, so these are winter residents, birds that not just birds that were banded in the winter, but were present and stayed and recited repeatedly over the winter. So they were actually spending the winter at Ed's yard, using the feeders there. From year 2, we had 2 returning the next year, and then in our third winter, you'll notice we had many more captures. And actually, as of the date I'm recording this on November 1st, 2022, Ed has already recited 10 of those previous winter residents. So, based not counting this year yet, that we are still still not even in winter, and we're getting a bunch of resites. But 3 out of 22 from the first 2 years is a 13.6% return rate. And it turns out that that's pretty comparable to other return rates, winter return rates that have been documented in the literature. So, one point of clarification is not all resiting and winter return estimates in the literature are methods are consistent. So our study was based on intensive resiting efforts. Some reports on return rates are simply based on a couple banding occasions, and how many birds were recaptured through banding. In most cases, they've not been color banded like in our study. But even so, we find that our return rates are in the range of those that have been reported for juncos. Um, and our sample size is small. We're still collecting data, but based on this, our observations and from previous studies, it's you're probably not seeing the same juncos at your feeder from year to year. That's a question I often get asked. Are they the same individuals? And they are probably not. They're probably different individuals. A second takeaway is that we observed two very different winters from the perspective of the juncos, just in terms of junco behavior and junco numbers. So I'm going to zoom in on these two middle bars here to focus on this here. So winter we defined as December, January, and February. So those calendar months. So how many new junco captures did we have during the winter? Well, during that first, or not first winter, but winter of 2021, we had relatively few new captures versus the following year, where we had nearly 70 new captures just during the winter. So we had a lot more movement and a lot more total number of birds during the winter, this overwintering period. The first full winter we had, 2021, we had 11 total overwintering juncos, not just new captures, but also birds that were banded in the fall that then stayed for the winter. So total overwintering juncos. And that whole flock that came around that first full winter we had all of them banded. They were all regulars coming to the feeder. But that second winter, we had over 73 overwintering juncos, so that we confirmed repeatedly visiting over the winter, including birds that were banded in the fall, stayed for the winter, and birds that were banded during the winter and stayed for the remaining part of the winter. Plus, we had many throughout the winter unbanded juncos that were observed. So we never ended up catching them all during that winter 21-22. And from Ed's what he would call his clinical impression. He's a retired veterinarian, and he would often use this terminology that, based on observing the juncos from his cabin, he would say his clinical impression that in over 15 years of observing the birds around his house, he had never seen anything like this with so many juncos in this winter 21-22. So something weird was going on. And it was not just a trapping effort issue. We did put some more effort in that winter, but it doesn't account for the total number of juncos observed because of we just didn't have more juncos the year before to even try to catch. They were all banded in that winter 2021. We don't think that feeding is causing the juncos to short stop, because when we looked at our fall recaptures, we still saw both falls the typical behavior for migrants, where they would come, be caught. Some would leave immediately or not be recited immediately, and some would be recited for about 2 weeks and then disappear. So we still had similar numbers of those fall birds behaving that way, but just many, many more staying. Well, we don't know if they were staying, but birds showing up, or birds that we missed banding on earlier occasions and then were catching during that winter 21-22. So something was going on weird. And it seems like, as the more we think about it, the behavior of juncos in that winter 21-22 is somewhat like eruptive species, where large numbers would show up on one day, potentially not be seen in large numbers a day or two or a week later, and then be seen in large numbers again, especially factoring in or adding in the unbanded juncos that would show up. So we don't really know what's going on there, but some of the behaviors in terms of the appearances over the course of that winter really seems like eruptive patterns in juncos. And one of our most surprising results related to migratory strategy is that we confirmed 5 juncos as year-round residents. So I'm actually going to highlight these 5. There's some similarities, but there's also some differences. Our first one was one that we banded in our first winter, so February 2020. So the evidence that we have from our observations at this study site and others, and also from the literature, is that by early March, juncos could be moving around February is possible, but not very likely, like super not likely. But by March, even early March, they could be moving around. It seems like most of that movement starts for our region in mid March, however. But this bird that was banded in late winter remained at Ed's yard throughout the summer and was repeatedly recited during the summer 2020. The next male, BYAS, was banded in spring, stayed at the yard through the summer, repeatedly observed, and then overwintered at Ed's yard the next winter. Was last observed March 31st, 2022, and since I put these slides together, actually has returned back to Ed's yard fall 22. So that bird still is around. We don't know where it overwintered last summer, however. That's interesting. It wintered in Ed's yard 2 summers ago, but did not this past summer. The third individual is a year-round resident, is also a male, banded in the spring, stayed in Ed's yard during the summer, repeatedly observed. We had nests, but we didn't confirm these individuals at the nests necessarily. And then it stayed and overwintered at the yard that winter. Didn't spend the next summer, but then stayed at the yard, or has been resighted now this fall and has returned, presumably, potentially to stay for the winter. Okay, and then we have 2 year-round residents that were resighted away from the yard from opportunistically. So, excuse me, one was resighted about, do I have the distance here? About 600 meters away at this person's house, who's a friend of Ed's, and they called up Ed one day and said, "Hey, why is there this banded bird here?" And we went and banded it and have observed it multiple times now since then. But it was banded at the yard in the winter, stayed the summer, and was repeatedly observed at this yard here. The next summer came back and was seen at Ed's house for the winter, and then spent the next summer, summer 22, at the yard again. And so we'll see where it ends up. But it's been repeatedly resighted at both locations throughout the year. And then we had a recovery through the bird banding lab, a female at this house about 700 meters away. So this bird was banded in the fall and overwintered at Ed's yard. And then we recited it, the last being in March 30th. And then we got a report from the bird banding lab in June that it was recovered here. I wasn't able to get the carcass by the time all the emails got to me and the report from the bird banding lab, but I did reach out to the homeowner who was not a birder and had no idea about birds, or it was not really helpful, except that the homeowner did report this to the bird banding lab. So thank you so much for doing that. But unfortunately, we weren't able to get any more information than that, whether it was seen repeatedly around that person's house or anything like that. So that's pretty interesting that we have confirmed some year-round residency in juncos. And our fourth takeaway here is that most overwintering juncos are actually departing in spring over about a 4-week period. So what I've blocked off here on this graph is the dates from March 10th to April 1st. And you can see the different winters here. These are just overwintering birds. So we're not counting birds that are just kind of a once and gone, but birds that we've confirmed staying the winter. So when do they leave the yard? What I want you to notice is this steep drop off in all of these plots over this 4-week period from March 10th to April 1st. So that's when they're leaving. Interestingly, if we superimpose our spring arrivals, or when we start to capture new birds during the spring, we also have, starting in mid-March, a noticeable influx of unbanded juncos. So we have this time period where our winter residents are starting to disappear, presumably leave to their breeding grounds, wherever that is, near or far. But we also have new birds showing up in the yard, taking advantage of the bird feeders, which are almost certainly migrants showing up, and we're banding them, and they're displaying the typical pattern of spring migrants of being captured, resighted, potentially not again at all, maybe a day or two or up to 7 to 10 days, and then they're disappearing for the most part as well. Exceptions being those couple individuals that stay around the yard. Okay, so that's pretty interesting that we have this influx of unbanded juncos and the winter residents that are still present in the yard, and they're all mixing together to some degree in that same location. So to summarize, to conclude here, so we found that there is a year-round resident population of juncos in western Massachusetts. So we at least have one piece of evidence about a migratory strategy, which is to not migrate in this portion of that year-round, that portion of their population where they're found year-round. So certainly some individuals, there's an influx of migrants in the winter based on just total numeracy, the abundance that we get during the fall and winter. But there's also some that are here year round. In the fall and spring, we get large influx of those migrants, large numbers of captures, many of which are not seen again. After a period of 1 to 10 days or so. Our overwintering populations can vary dramatically from year to year. We really are thinking that juncos are displaying some real similar patterns to eruptive species. We don't tend to classify them as eruptive because they're seen typically each year, but the numbers are really suggestive of a eruptive pattern. So we hope to look into that a little bit more. And we have so much resighting data, so we're still kind of struggling with how to maximize the utility of our resight data with literally a couple thousand resights over these winters of these banded birds. So with that, I'd like to thank a variety of people who have contributed to this project, lots of undergraduate field assistants, and especially, I'd like to thank the neighbors who have reported banded birds, um, and either directly to Ed or through the bird banding laboratory. So, with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening to this presentation, and I'd love if you would reach out to me to chat about juncos sometime, or if you have any ideas about furthering this research. Thank you very much.